Well, welcome to Discerning Faith Podcast. I am Daryl.
I am Nathan.
And last time on the podcast, we talked about feudal society and monastic orders and society and just how that interacts with the church and with hierarchy and all that. And in this episode, we're going to get into the isms and schisms of the church, as Nathan has coined it now, and I like that. And thank you for joining us. So moving into the next thing we want to talk about, and this was still so the first thing that kind of pops up, and there's two that are kind of very closely related, I guess you'd say, is rationalism and scholasticism.
We're talking a lot of isms here.
Yeah. So we're going to go into the ism part of the discussion. So
going back to those monks, it's like there's a lot of debates on what's going on with theology in this time and one of the key questions is, how do we know what we know?
Right.
In general and about God himself.
So rationalism kind of goes back to, God gave us a mind.
Mm-hmm.
We can think through things rationally and make inferences and even ideas based off of that fact. And a lot of rationalism goes back to either Platonic or Aristotelian. So Plato or Aristotle, the Greek philosophers, they go back to a lot of their ideas. Some of them would say that God divinely taught Aristotle, not taught, but like it was brought about through them. Others would just say, hey, look, God gave everybody minds. Common grace says that some people are very smart, so we're going to use
what God is a God of logic and order himself. So in the sense we're made in the image of God, we can use these things as well.
Absolutely. So a lot of rationalism is built off of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy, and there's goods and bads that come with that. But there's kind of this rigorous kind of almost pull between rationalism and later on humanism, but really just rationalism and trying to say, well, we don't need rational, because there are a lot of things that if you look at some doctrines, they're not going to make sense rationally, at least in our minds.
Like as much as, the universe cries out about there being a God, but I'm not going to necessarily understand what the heck the Trinity is by going out on a nature walk or something like that, or observing the stars at night. May give me a idea of there being a God, a creator who is powerful beyond all our imagination. But there's certain aspects of God that we are not going to understand without God directly telling us. So,
Yeah, so rationalism can be, and we kind of tend to look at the extremes of everything when you're doing history. And I want to be careful that we're not saying all rationalists were so far that, we can't do anything that's not rational.
Right.
Because that's not the case. In fact, most of the time I'd say it wasn't the case. It's actually more extreme that they would say, if we can't understand it rationally, then we can't deal with it, right? There's a few that kind of go that far, but most of them, it just says, hey, we have logic, we have a brain that works, let's use it to interact with God's word and what he, in theology. So
also sorry for any meowing you hear in the background. My cat is now suddenly very vocal and wanting to join in the conversation, but we don't have an interpreter, so we're not going to allow him. And the opposite of that would be, well, we just take everything as a mystery and we don't really try to parse out anything. To some degree, the Orthodox Church leans into this pretty heavily, though they still have some explanation. They don't, just say, well, everything's a mystery and just take everything we say for granted. They try to work things out as well, but maybe not quite to the same degree as the Catholic Church at this time. And by this point, they were pretty well split after the Great Schism.
Yeah.
Which we may get into another episode. That's pretty interesting. Some of the differences there, but not necessarily key to what we're talking about here
with government and stuff. Yeah.
So essentially, how's faith and reason work out together? Whether they're separate, one leads to the other, or whether they work together. Some of your famous theological thinkers throughout the medieval times are wrestling with this question. One of the probably the most prominent being Saint Thomas Aquinas.
So. And if you talk to a Catholic person who is involved in a lot of theology and philosophy, Christian philosophy, we'll call it, that's one of the first and foremost they'll probably talk about is Thomas Aquinas.
Him or Augustine.
Yeah, him or Augustine, exactly. So that being said, if you go to an Eastern Orthodox or just the Orthodox Church, they don't really care much to interact much with either of those. So There's kind of the difference there.
Mhm.
They have their own theologians that they really look
Mhm.
up to, and I don't know them, so I'm not going to try to, but
And there is a certain thing to appreciate that we're not going to rationalize everything out, and some things are going to be a mystery to us, as Deuteronomy 29:29 says. Secret things are the Lord's. There are things we're not going to understand. So I think that's one of the things that you have to make sure you're tempering any sort of rationalistic philosophy with, is understanding we're just not going to have all the answers in this life, as much as that drives most of us nuts.
Yeah.
But
But
to keep that, yeah.
but again, I think the important thing there is, and as one of my favorite internet pastors, that I'll call him, even though he's a pastor of a local church, but um, Vodi Bakum says is, there's a ditch on both sides of the road.
Mhm.
And a lot of the time that's the case. This isn't Eastern philosophy where we have to yin and yang, and I'm not talking anything like that. But typically, as humans, we want to go to the extreme, as I think we've talked about previously. And so a lot of the time there's something in the middle that kind of fits, because there are mysteries that God has given us,
Mhm.
and there's rationalism that we can go, that can rationally make this work. This
Mhm.
makes sense. And so we have to find that goes together.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
Scholasticism, just real quick, if you've ever heard that, is kind of taught in our day as a very rigorous bad thing almost, right? It's this looking at things in a very strong mental, not really, almost like kind of like in a laboratory where you're very removed from things.
Mhm.
I think it gets a little bit of a bad rap. I think scholasticism has its place, can be really good,
Mhm.
rigorous, you know, um, academics, both when it comes to theology, but also other subjects. We should use our minds and use them well.
Mhm.
Our pastor likes to say a mind is a terrible thing to use. And I get what he's getting at,
Mhm.
but I also think we can go too far either way. Once again,
Mhm.
you know, at least for me, I love working through things, thinking through things,
Mhm.
wrestling with things, in a very specific, breaking things down using my brain,
Mhm.
Um, if you just tell me I need to believe it because I need to believe it, it's not good enough for me.
Mhm.
And even things that I know I'll never completely understand, I like wrestling with those and getting to a point where, okay, I may not have a set thing that I understand, and I'm like, oh, don't worry, guys, I got the Trinity figured out.
I'm the expert now.
Yes. No, it's not that. It's more just the more I wrestle with those things, the more I understand about God, and the more I feel more appreciative of what he's done, who he is, and
Mhm.
and all that. And I feel closer to him, and I feel it brings me in more communion with him, so I can be living out his will better,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the Lord commands us to love him with all our mind as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that's the way everybody will, but I think in our society, a lot of time we go, oh, well, it's about what he does, ask him into your heart and believe. Okay, that's part of it, but it's a little more than that,
Also, what the heck does that even mean?
Exactly. It's not in the Bible, folks. So yeah, anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. But then the last thing we want to just kind of hit on real quick is conciliarism. So
And that's going to get into some of the church corruption we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But essentially, one of the things they're debating is church structure to a degree. How much say does the Pope have? How much say do councils have to kind of control wayward popes? As we're going to see, there's going to be some wayward popes along the way. Um, which is interesting. They're having this debate because the Great Schism, with the split off with the Orthodox, kind of have a lot of similarities in this debate as well, where the Catholics were saying, no, the Pope is the main guy. We don't need any of the other of the bishops to kind of key in on what's going on. The Orthodox, no, we had a structure. We had all of the bishops, the 5 bishops together, and that's how the church structure is supposed to work. And so it was a little bit of a funny aside. And again, if we get into the Great Schism, the Orthodox Catholic Schism, we'll talk about that more. But essentially, the whole debate about how church should be structured, particularly at the highest levels, was a continuing debate throughout the ages as well.
Well, and in the Orthodox Church now, they still do have a main person that you could call their Pope, but it's not in the same way. It's more of a, this is the one that leads, but it's not that he has this. He doesn't take the place of Christ. He doesn't, anything like
He's
that.
a leader among of equal brethren. at that
Yeah.
particular level. So,
Because you got to have somebody in charge.
Mhm.
It's just the way it's got to work. I'm
Yep.
sorry, guys, but it is.
Yep. And so that's so I don't remember if I actually defined it. So conciliarism is the view that the council needs to have higher authority to overturn rogue popes. So,
Mhm. And we'll get it like Nathan said, we're gonna get into this more. But basically, the quick part of this, just to kind of give a complete understanding of conciliarism, is there is this constant, what's the word, tension
Mhm.
between, okay, we have these councils, they're the ones that, if a council says it, this is canon law, right?
We talked about some of the early councils, but they're having these pretty frequently. Eventually, they decide we need to have one at least every 10 years at a minimum. So,
But again, some of the times that's because it's a good biblical principle, and sometimes it's because no, we want the power. So we're going to get into this more, but a lot of the time it's well, is the Pope in charge, or are these councils are in charge, or are the local priests in charge? There's this constant kind of almost bickering back and forth of no, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. And
look at me,
just
I'm the
kinda
capture now.
ridiculous. Yes. So anyway, so there's that.
So going from there, I mean, we talked about some of the kind of pre-reformers as well, or at least pre-reformed theologians as well, when talking about Augustine and some of the others. But there were a lot of debates back and forth talking about these different isms, and some focused more on particular ones than others. Some of their theologies were very broad, like Aquinas. He hit a ton of different topics in his times. And other people focused more on very specific things. And some people were focusing only on reactions to other things that people said. And so that sometimes got into very weird territory as well. There's a wide, healthy variety going on at the time. We're going to mention kind of three right now that tie a little bit more into the whole church politics sphere. But
so to kind of transition from rationalism and all that, so we'll start with William of Ockham, which William of Ockham is where we get Occam's razor, which, by the way, Ockham was not his last name. That's why it's of Ockham. That's just where he was from. But Occam's razor, most of you have probably heard it, and the way it's boiled down, and probably incorrectly, or at least misleadingly today, is that the most basic way to understand something is probably the best way to understand.
If all else is equal.
If all else is equal.
If I come in and, I don't have any children right now, but if Daryl goes home and the children's room is a mess, he could either assume that maybe some Eastern European mercenaries were hired to come in and mess up the room real quick. We're searching for something buried under the boards in the room or something, and made a mess of things and got out before anyone else got home. Or that maybe the kids just didn't pick up their toys.
No.
Probably the second one is the more logical and simpler explanation there. Theoretically, I guess maybe you have your Eastern European mercenaries in your house right now.
I mean, I'm a lot more important than I realized, but it's kind of like the whole old saying, when you hear horses when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras, right? Because at least in most places, unless you're in Africa, if you hear hooves, it's going to be a horse.
Zoo that's having issues with security.
Exactly. They're loose. Again, so that's the whole idea that we boil it down to. I think there's a lot more to it. We're not going to get into a lot of detail with it.
Yeah. And he wasn't necessarily the guy who invented it, but he used it so much in his philosophy and theology that it kind of just got associated with him just by his use and probably overuse of the tools.
So basically William of Ockham says, hey, you guys, you rationalistic guys, you can't really do it quite the way you're doing. He basically comes on the scene, gives a scathing, this isn't the way to do it. Doesn't really give a positive way, this is how you should do it. Gets into politics and kind of goes off the scene pretty much. I mean, that's a very, very dumbed down, basic idea of what happened. But that's what we need to know for what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So
I'll take Hus because I liked him.
Okay.
So then there was also Jan Hus, who, if any of you have looked into the Moravian church before, was kind of somewhat the origins of, and kind of not at the same time, because that is a weird history in and of itself. But essentially, he did some pretty scathing reviews on a lot of the institutions of the Catholic Church as well, even before the Reformers. But like Luther himself would identify himself with the Hussites and with the critiques of like the indulgences and things like that the Catholic Church had started getting into that were not good biblical practices. And John Huss himself, or Jan Hus, I think, actually with the European pronunciation, was trying to, again, not break apart from the church, but kind of correct, like, hey, these are issues. But he was still a lay pastor. He was still trying to minister to his flock in the Catholic faith. But unfortunately, by this point, the Catholic faith had really cracked down on a lot of, well, if you're speaking up against us, you just need to shut up and sit down and just knock it off here. Kind of like my cat needs to do with knocking it off right now. Yeah, but, and so Huss was against a lot of these things, and eventually he gets some of the executive power, we'll call it, of the Catholic Church smacked down on him. And so he ends up, kind of being excommunicated and all that jazz, which has its own applications in the modern sense. But all that to say, he was burned at the stake, right?
Yes.
He was burned at the stake, and his own followers were not happy about that. And part of them were a little bit more peaceful, part of them were a little bit more militant. And the militant ones actually end up kind of taking over, and kicking some European butts in like actual warfare as well, and carving out their own stake, and kind of pseudo-seed from the Catholic Church and their influence in the area.
So is it medium rare?
Yeah.
The steak.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
And kind of carving out their own thing. There's still some loose affiliation with the Catholic Church, but it's kind of, again, one of these things that's leading up to the whole Reformation and the big separation away from the Catholic Church as well.
Yeah. And we'll get into more what he was going against the church about.
Mm-hmm.
Nathan mentioned indulgences, a couple other things. We'll get into that here in a minute. But the last one we wanted to mention was just John Wycliffe.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. You have probably heard of Wycliffe before, at least through the Wycliffe Bible.
Mm-hmm.
He was I believe he was a pastor.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly, but I think he was a pastor also. And his big thing was, we need to get the Bible in the common language, common vernacular of the people. And so he set to make it happen. So he translated the Bible. I think he started with the New Testament. I don't remember if he ever ended up getting to the Old Testament, but I know he did the New Testament. Translates it into English, and the church at the time says, that's not supposed to happen.
They're supposed to speak in our hoity-toity Latin that no one else speaks for any other purposes these days.
Yep. And so he goes on trial, goes to his trial, but he dies before they could, execute him, actually. And so, because
they took all the fun.
It's not good enough for him to die. They literally bring him, get his remains, pull them back out, and burn them just to prove a point, which is ridiculous. But anyway, so there's that. So what were they talking about? Why were these people going against the church, and what was getting the church so upset?
Well, bad practices, really. So there's a lot of like immoral or unbiblical practices, and a lot of Protestants will pretty quickly catch on to these, because they've talked a lot about, well, why are we different from them, and why was Luther a thing? A lot of these pop back up with him. So one of the early ones we talked about was indulgences. And to kind of give a quick overlay, we talked about them a little bit with the Crusades as well. Now we're thinking about it, but again, going back to, there's a Catholic view of purgatory, which at least the Orthodox and Protestant churches do not find to be biblical, and I strongly agree with such. But essentially, purgatory, you're working off your own. You didn't quite make it to heaven, but you're not quite in hell. You're kind of doing time until you can work your way back into God's good graces and get to heaven, essentially.
Right.
And ways we can shorten the time. One, Crusades, if that's just a free pass, and that'll get you all your time off. But they also sold indulgences, which is essentially you pay a little bit of money to the church as part of their fundraising drive. They didn't necessarily say it like that, but it was pretty well used as such. And either for yourself or for family members or friends who've already passed, that'll be time off for them, and that will help reduce how much time before they can get their way into heaven themselves.
Yep.
Very unscriptural practice there.
Another thing that kind of arose during this time was that the idea of there were a lot of immoral priests that
Mhm.
kind of rose up at this time, not rose up, but just it became a thing at this time. And the Catholic Church said, well, don't worry about it. Their office makes things fine.
Mhm.
So the sacraments are fine. Don't worry about it. It doesn't really matter what the priest does on his own time, but his office makes it okay.
The authority that he himself carries is what's important here,
Yeah.
rather than whether he's a good, actual, upstanding moral character or
Mhm.
not.
Which of course we go, huh?
Mhm.
That's not how that works. But at the time, that was very acceptable to a lot,
Mhm.
and so these pre-reformers and eventually reformers start going, no, this is not a thing.
Mhm.
So that was one of the other issues.
And then we get into some pretty juicy politics with some of this. I was fascinated with some of this. So talking about kind of some of the specific, I guess, priests and church leaders, corruption and whatnot. Um, so you have like different political centers of power, or different religious centers of power, pardon me, in the church itself. So most of the time we think of Rome, which is where the Bishop of Rome comes from, and it's the seat of where Peter was allegedly and all that jazz.
Right.
And so that's where the Catholic Church headquarters were kind of for the most part.
Mhm.
In the 1300s, however, it briefly moved to France for a period of like 70 years.
Right.
Yeah, 70 years. Um, for a brief period of time, partly because Rome, it wasn't necessarily the place to be, and you could still have a home away from home, and that's kind of their view of things. They end up getting some land in France, and one of the popes decides, yeah, we're gonna go up there. You have some weird church politics where one pope gets the job and decides he doesn't want the job, and so he decrees that he can resign, and thereby resigns,
Mhm.
which was not done up to that point at all. Then the next guy takes charge and is like, that guy was a heretic. Let's get him. And so he imprisons the previous pope on charges of heresy. And you can start seeing where there's some of these corruption things coming in from that. And that pope ends up fighting with other theological thinkers such as Dante. He ends up picking some fights with the King of France over taxing of the clergy, which kind of gets back into that monastic thing we were talking about earlier, where the King of France was trying to tax the monastic orders and whatnot and get extra fundings for himself from all that. Um, Eventually, the fights break up or go so hard that our good Pope Boniface says that, you know what, I alone have the right to determine what happens in European politics. So again, talking about how do should the church and politics interrelate? Well, he says that the church and he alone, as God's vicar on earth, has control over all of the politics of Europe. And yeah, that's a pretty hard claim to make there.
Yep.
Uh, Eventually, though, he dies. And a couple of popes later, they actually get back to Rome eventually. But there's already some fracturing there because the popes were in France for a good 70 years. And so you have a lot of cardinals during that time, kind of a little bit underneath there, but still higher up in the church, who are French and very nationalistic and think that no, maybe the papacy should stay over here in France. Which leads us to the papal schism. Did you once know that there were 3 popes at the same time?
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep. So I taught this class at our church about a year ago, I guess, or around that. And it's crazy to me. But basically what happens, right,
Mhm.
is the Pope in Rome's like, I'm French. I kind of want to go back home,
Mhm.
but I kind of want to be Pope still.
Mhm.
So, and I don't like it here. These Romans are weird, and these Italians, I don't care for them.
You
I'm
talk
going to
about
move
their
it,
fancy meatballs.
probably. And, mafia, no, just
Mhm.
kidding. That probably wasn't part of it. But anyway, so he says, I'm moving it to Avignon. So they move it up to France and Avignon, and everybody's going, what are you doing?
Mhm.
Because something we kind of lose sometimes in Protestant translation is there were the specific popes,
Mm.
or not popes, sorry, bishops of certain cities that had the prominence. That's
Mhm.
the way it was set up for years. There was Alexandria, there was Constantinople,
Mhm.
there was Jerusalem, and then there was Rome.
Mhm.
And Rome was the main one in the West, right? Because all three of the other ones were in the East.
Mhm.
So now that we have the Great Schism, it's Rome, right? So to move it to Rome, from Rome to the middle of nowhere comparatively, I mean,
Mhm.
France was a big deal at that time. I'm not trying to say anything
Right.
about that, but
For
this
its
was
historic
huge.
religious roots.
Yes. Now, we can get into the whole debate of should we be that worried because it's just tradition, that kind of thing. But nonetheless, this causes a huge issue. And you kind of had to know that was going to come.
Mhm.
So it gets moved back. One guy gets elected and he says, I'm going to move it back to Rome.
Mhm.
Gets sick and dies.
Mhm.
The next guy goes, I kind of like it back in Avignon. So he moves back to Avignon. But by that point, all the Italian cardinals were kind of like, no, we're about over this. It's been 70 years. We're gonna we're just gonna elect our own pope. How about we do that? And so this pope gets elected, right?
French Pope, Italian Pope.
Yep. So we have a French pope and an Italian pope, and then a council's called because we can't have two popes, guys. Come on.
The political leaders in Europe were confused and were like,
Yep.
whose side are we on here? Whose decrees are actually real here? Because we're trying to listen, but we're getting two conflicting messages here.
Yep. So the Italian pope puts an interdict over France, which an interdict is literally none of the sacraments can be performed. So in other words, we're going to keep you from doing anything, with God, essentially, which does the church have that power? We can get into that debate some other time, but nonetheless. So then the Avignon pope says, okay, no, you guys are under interdict. So there's this constant bickering back and forth, right? So a council's called because, council's going to fix everything.
Mm-hmm.
Council says, nope, you both are not pope anymore. We're going to elect this pope. So now we have three popes.
Mm-hmm.
Now nobody knows what's going on, right?
Because the other popes do not want to give up theirs. So
yeah, because and the council basically says, well, you two popes, we've elected a new one. Step down. They're like, no.
And the new one was also pretty darn corrupt as well.
Yes. So then the political powers kind of get involved and say, hey guys, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, particularly Sigismund of the Holy Roman Empire, which and it's one of those areas where it's like, oh, we should keep church and politics completely separated. Actually, a guy from the politics realm helps fix a lot of issues here.
Yep.
Says, knock it off. Get this figured out. Yep. We're tired of this.
Yep. So eventually they finally elect a fourth pope, and all the other three eventually kind of go,
yeah, you're all dismissed. Go away. This is the new pope.
But what it really took was political power getting involved and saying, okay, enough.
Political power who probably partly for political reasons, but also for genuine wanting of unity in the faith.
Yeah.
Telling the church, hey, get your act together here. We need, again, kind of reminds you a little bit of Constantine and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the Avignon papacy, or it's also known as the Papal Schism, not to be confused with the Great Schism, which is Orthodox and Roman Catholic. But so this is the kind of stuff. So kind of picture yourself as either a typical parishioner, or more importantly, a priest who's just trying to go about his day, trying to work with people, help bring them to the Lord, help them work through being their shepherds and helping them. And you're looking at the church going, what is going on, guys? Come on. And literally, it's nothing more than power. So going back to conciliarism, this is when that point when the council says, okay, we need to meet every 10 years. And by the way, you need to run everything by us. And the Pope goes, no, I'm the Pope now. Yeah. Thank you. So they thought he'd be on their side because they got him his power, right? And there's this constant struggle between who has power, the Pope or the council. Who makes the decisions around here, right?
As kind of from all this tension is where we get the whole, papal infallibility idea of the Catholic Church, where no, the Pope is the final say, is kind of the opposition to this whole council conciliarism.
That's very much where all this starts, exactly. So many people are kind of going,
oh, sorry, I was right about at the hour mark, so.
Oh, okay. Do we want to call it there? Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, we can start the Reformation stuff if that's what, unless there was anything else on the whole church corruption thing.
I was just going to kind of work into the Reformation, but if we want to do the next one, we can do that.
So it's kind of a lead-in. How about that?
Yeah. So a lot of people are kind of going, okay, this is kind of getting out of control. And of course, you guys know, probably you've heard of Martin Luther, and he kind of comes on the scene and kind of stirs everything up. But again, that didn't start with him, and this corruption had not started well before, or right just when Martin Luther. And something I hate hearing when you hear about Martin Luther is, oh, well, he was just, he just didn't want to fall in line. He didn't want authority, which is, I think, really funny from people nowadays, because we're the first to question authority. We're the first to say, no, that's wrong.
You ain't the boss of me.
Now, did Martin Luther always do everything right? No. Did he have some views, especially like on the Jews and stuff, that were probably misguided at best, or at worst? No, at best. Yeah, at best, or maybe even just plain, wrong, really wrong on his part. Yeah, but I think God brought the right person for the right time. So maybe next episode we can kind of really get into that a little more, and we'll kind of go from there. And we're going to, again, fast forward a little bit after that into, the Puritans, kind of some of the movements in America, and talk about the
because America is all that matters.
Well, yeah, we're American. It is what it is.
So yes,
it is what it is. But I think America is a specific counterpoint to the way things had been done historically for so long. And so I think that's why America is a good place to kind of go. One, because we know it well because we're from America, but also I think it was very different. It was a new experiment. And so we can talk about that.
And how well did the experiment work? And
yeah.
Who all did we pull in from for all this experiment as well? So we have quite a few still theological fathers that we're kind of taken in from and traditions. So
absolutely. So you can see this gets messy. We want to kind of finish through this history, but then we're going to get some into the biblical ideal of,
what is this balance supposed to be like?
Yeah, what should this look like? And we can get into that next time. So,
all right. Well, for right now, this has been Discerning Faith. Thank you for joining us. The Lord be with you and bless you.